April 16th, 1457 BC. The morning sun rose over the Jezreel Valley, casting long shadows across the plain of Megiddo. On this day, warfare would change forever. For the first time in recorded history, massed formations of archers wielding composite bows would decide the outcome of a major battle. The consequences would echo through military history for millennia. This is the story of how Pharaoh Thutmose III and his Egyptian army revolutionized warfare at Megiddo, and how the concentrated fire of thousands of arrows transformed the ancient battlefield. To understand what happened at Megiddo, we must first understand what came before. For thousands of years, warfare in the ancient Near East had been dominated by hand-to-hand combat. Infantry armed with spears, axes, and clubs formed the backbone of every army. Battles were decided by the courage of individual warriors, the strength of their arms, the sharpness of their bronze weapons. Archery existed, certainly. The bow had been used for hunting and warfare since time immemorial, but it was a supplementary weapon, used for skirmishing, for harassing enemy formations, for picking off stragglers. No one had yet conceived of archery as a decisive weapon, as the primary killing instrument that could break enemy formations before they ever reached striking distance. The technology that would change everything arrived in Egypt not through innovation but through conquest. During the Second Intermediate Period, around 1700 BC, foreign invaders called the Hyksos swept into the Nile Delta. They brought with them three revolutionary military technologies: the horse, the chariot, and the composite bow. The Egyptians had known archery for millennia. Tomb paintings from the Old Kingdom, dating back to 2800 BC, show Egyptian hunters and soldiers carrying bows. But these were simple self-bows carved from a single piece of wood. They were effective enough for hunting game or defending city walls, but their range and power were limited by the natural properties of wood. A wooden bow could only be bent so far before it would snap. The composite bow changed the equation entirely. Instead of relying on a single material, it used three. A core of wood provided flexibility. Horn, typically from ibex or wild goats, was attached to the belly of the bow, the side facing the archer. When the bow was drawn, this horn compressed, storing enormous amounts of energy. Sinew from cattle or other large animals was layered on the back of the bow, the side facing away from the archer. This sinew stretched when the bow was drawn, again storing energy. The entire construction was bound together with glue made from animal collagen and covered with bark or leather to protect it from moisture. The result was a weapon of unprecedented power. While a simple wooden bow might achieve an effective range of 150 yards, a well-made composite bow could reach 250 yards or more. Its arrows could penetrate leather armor at distances that would have seemed impossible to earlier archers. Perhaps more importantly, the composite bow was shorter than the traditional Egyptian longbow, making it ideal for use from chariot platforms. An archer standing in a moving chariot needed a compact weapon that could be drawn and released quickly, without the unwieldy length of a 6-foot wooden bow. Initially, the Egyptians learned these technologies through bitter experience. The Hyksos dominated Lower Egypt for over a century, their chariot archers proving devastatingly effective against traditional Egyptian infantry. But the Egyptians were quick learners. By the time Ahmose expelled the Hyksos around 1550 BC and founded the 18th dynasty, the Egyptians had not only adopted these foreign innovations but improved upon them. Under the New Kingdom pharaohs, Egypt transformed itself into a military powerhouse. The army was reorganized into professional divisions, each numbering around 5,000 men. These divisions included specialized units, infantry armed with spears and shields, chariot corps equipped with the latest technology, and most significantly, dedicated archer battalions. The Egyptian military recognized something that would not be fully appreciated by other ancient powers for centuries. In warfare, killing the enemy at distance was vastly preferable to closing to hand range. Every yard you could keep between your forces and the enemy was a yard where you could inflict casualties while remaining relatively safe. And if you could coordinate the fire of hundreds or thousands of archers, focusing their arrows on specific points in the enemy formation, you could achieve effects that individual archers never could. The Egyptians called their professional archer corps the Pejeh, organized into units of approximately 250 men. But the elite of Egyptian archery were the Nubian mercenaries, warriors from the land south of Egypt whom the Egyptians themselves called the greatest archers in the world. The Egyptians referred to Nubia as Taseti, the land of the bow, a testament to Nubian skill with the weapon. These Nubian archers, integrated into the Egyptian army during the New Kingdom, could fire with accuracy and rapidity that few could match. They trained from childhood, developing the incredible upper body strength needed to repeatedly draw a composite bow that might require 60 to 80 pounds of force. Training an archer took years. Unlike a spearman, who could learn the basics of his trade in weeks, an effective archer needed to develop specific muscle memory, learn to judge distance and windage, understand how to lead a moving target, master the art of rapid fire. The Egyptian military invested heavily in this training. Young recruits practiced on targets at varying distances. They learned to shoot from different stances, kneeling, standing, moving. They practiced until they could knock, draw, and release, in a fluid motion that took only seconds. Most crucially, they trained to shoot not as individuals but as units, learning to coordinate their fire so that hundreds of arrows would fall on a target zone simultaneously. The arrows themselves were marvels of ancient engineering. Each arrow was constructed from a reed shaft, lightweight but strong, with a wooden foreshaft attached at the front. The arrowhead, in the New Kingdom period, was typically bronze, though flint heads were still used. These heads came in various designs: bodkin points, thin and needle-like, designed to pierce armour; broader hunting points that would cause massive bleeding; barbed points that were nearly impossible to remove from flesh. The fletching, made from bird feathers, was carefully shaped and attached to ensure the arrow flew straight. A poorly made arrow would tumble in flight, losing both accuracy and penetrating power. An Egyptian archer might carry between 40 and 60 arrows in his quiver. At sustained combat rates, firing roughly one arrow every 6 to 8 seconds, an archer could empty his quiver in 5 to 8 minutes. This meant that logistics were crucial. Behind every archer unit were runners whose job was to bring forward fresh supplies of arrows. In a major battle, tens of thousands of arrows might be expended in the first hour of fighting alone. Now, with this understanding of the technology and training behind Egyptian archery, we can turn to the events that led to Megiddo. In 1479 BC, Pharaoh Hatshepsut died. She had ruled Egypt as pharaoh for over 20 years, a reign marked by trade, prosperity, and generally peaceful foreign relations. Her co-regent and stepson, Thutmose III, had chafed under her rule for years, a trained warrior forced to watch as diplomatic missions replaced military campaigns. Upon her death, Thutmose III finally assumed full power. He was approximately 30 years old, in his physical prime, and burning with ambition to prove himself as a warrior king. He would not have to wait long for his opportunity. News reached Thebes that the vassal states in Canaan and Syria, regions that had nominally submitted to Egyptian overlordship, had risen in revolt. The rebellion was led by the king of Kadesh, a powerful city-state in Syria. He had formed a coalition of over 150 rulers from cities and tribes throughout the Levant. Their goal was to throw off Egyptian domination while Egypt was distracted by its recent change of leadership. The rebel coalition had gathered its forces at Megiddo, a fortress city in northern Canaan. The choice of location was strategically brilliant. Megiddo controlled the Via Maris, the main trade route connecting Egypt with Mesopotamia and the lands beyond. Whoever controlled Megiddo controlled the flow of commerce through the region. The city itself was heavily fortified, sitting on a hill that commanded the surrounding plain. It had strong walls, access to water, and could be easily supplied. If Thutmose wanted to reassert Egyptian control over the Levant, he would have to deal with Megiddo. Thutmose's response was swift and decisive. Within weeks of receiving news of the rebellion, he had mobilized the Egyptian army. His scribe, Tianeni, kept a daily journal of the campaign, recording details that would later be inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Amun-Re at Karnak. These inscriptions provide us with the first detailed account of a battle in recorded history, a document whose reliability, while not perfect, is accepted by modern scholars as substantially accurate. The Egyptian army that assembled at the border fortress of Chiaru was formidable. Historical estimates place its size between 10,000 and 20,000 men. This force included several divisions of infantry, approximately 1,000 chariots, and crucially thousands of archers. Among these were the elite Nubian bowmen, specialists in the use of the composite bow. This marks the first written reference to Nubians serving as specialized archer units in the Egyptian military, though they had certainly served in this capacity for years before Megiddo. The army marched north, covering the 150 miles to Gaza in just 10 days, an impressive feat of logistics and endurance. After a day's rest in Gaza, they continued north for 11 more days, reaching the city of Yehem, modern-day Khirbet Yemeh, south of present-day Jat in Israel. It was here, on approximately May 10th by the ancient Egyptian calendar, that Thutmose called a council of war. The situation was this. Between the Egyptian army and Megiddo lay the Carmel Ridge, a mountain range that could only be crossed by one of three routes. The northern route through Zefti and Yokneam was long but relatively safe. The southern route through Tarnak was similarly secure, but both would require additional days of marching and would telegraph Egyptian intentions to the enemy. The third route, the Aruna Pass, modern Wadi Ara, was the most direct. It would bring the Egyptian army out right in front of Megiddo, but it was also extremely dangerous. The pass was narrow, barely wide enough for two men to walk abreast. The Egyptian army would have to traverse it in single file, stretched out over miles. If the enemy was waiting at the far end, the Egyptians would emerge piecemeal, to be cut down before they could form up for battle. Thutmose's generals unanimously advised against the Aruna Pass. They argued that the risk was too great, that the king of Kadesh would certainly have troops guarding this obvious route. Better to take the safer paths, even if it meant a longer march. Thutmose disagreed. His reasoning was psychological. He argued that if his own generals believed the Aruna Pass was too dangerous, then the enemy would believe the same thing. They would expect him to take one of the safer routes and would position their forces accordingly. By taking the pass everyone expected him to avoid, he would achieve complete surprise. It was a calculated risk, but one Thutmose was willing to take. To emphasize his confidence, he declared that he would personally lead the army through the pass. If it was safe enough for the pharaoh, it was safe enough for everyone. His generals, shamed into agreement, assented. On May 12th, the Egyptian army entered the Aruna Pass. Thutmose rode at the very front in his golden war chariot flanked by his bodyguard. Behind him stretched the entire army, infantry, archers, chariots, supply wagons, all moving in single file through the narrow defile. It took 7 hours for the entire army to pass through. The vanguard emerged around noon. The rear guard did not clear the pass until evening, and they met no opposition. Thutmose's gamble had paid off. The king of Kadesh had indeed positioned his forces to guard the northern and southern routes, leaving the Aruna Pass virtually undefended. When word reached him that the Egyptians had taken the direct route and were emerging right in front of Megiddo, it was too late to effectively respond. The Egyptian army camped that night on the banks of the Kaina River, south of Megiddo. On the opposite bank, barely 2 miles away, lay the rebel army. According to Egyptian sources, the coalition forces numbered between 10,000 and 15,000 men, with approximately 1,000 war chariots. They had hastily repositioned from their defensive positions on the other routes, and were now arrayed in front of the city, with their backs to Megiddo's walls. That night, Thutmose held another council of war. He explained his battle plan. The Egyptian army would cross the river at dawn and deploy in 3 divisions. The southern wing would position itself on elevated ground south of the Kina. The northern wing would move northwest of Megiddo. Thutmose himself would command the centre, with the elite chariot units positioned near the town of Aruna, directly west of Megiddo. The formation would create a concave shape, with the wings curved forward, threatening to envelop the enemy, and crucially, massed archers would be positioned in all 3 divisions. This deployment was revolutionary. Traditional ancient armies placed archers on the flanks or in the rear, where they could provide supporting fire while the heavy infantry did the real fighting. But Thutmose's plan called for integrating archers throughout the formation, with dedicated archer units positioned to deliver concentrated fire on specific enemy positions. The Egyptian commanders understood that before the infantry closed, before the chariots charged, the archers would soften the enemy, creating confusion, casualties, and fear. Dawn on May 15th, 1457 BC. The Egyptian army crossed the Kaina River and deployed as planned. The rebel coalition, seeing the Egyptian dispositions, formed their own battle line. Their infantry was in the centre, their chariots on the wings. They had archers too, of course, but not organised and deployed with the same systematic doctrine as the Egyptians. As the 2 armies faced each other across the plain, separated by perhaps 600 yards, the Egyptian archer, units moved forward. Thousands of archers, many of them the elite Nubians, positioned themselves approximately 250 yards from the enemy. This was the maximum effective range of the composite bow, the distance at which a skilled archer could reasonably expect to hit a man-sized target. The rebel forces, seeing the archers advance, readied their own missiles, but they were not prepared for what came next. On command, the Egyptian archers drew their bows in unison. Thousands of composite bows were pulled to full draw, thousands of bronze-tipped arrows nocked and aimed, and then, on the signal of their commanders, they released. The sound alone must have been extraordinary. A hissing, rushing noise as thousands of arrows cut through the air simultaneously. The arrows arced upward, reaching the apex of their trajectory, perhaps 80 or 90 feet above the ground, then descended in a lethal rain onto the rebel formations. This was the moment that changed warfare. For the first time in recorded history, an army was using massed archery fire as its primary tactical weapon. The effect was devastating. Arrows struck shields, armour, unprotected flesh. Men screamed and fell, horses reared and bolted. The rebel formation, which had been tightly packed, began to waver and spread out as soldiers instinctively sought to avoid the killing zone. But there was no respite. Before the first volley had even landed, the Egyptian archers were knocking fresh arrows. 6 to 8 seconds after the first volley, a second wave of arrows fell on the rebels, then a third, then a fourth. The Egyptians had practiced this, trained for it. They knew how to maintain a continuous fire, one wave of archers releasing while another prepared their next shot. The mathematical reality of massed archery became horribly apparent. A trained archer could release approximately 8 to 10 arrows per minute. An Egyptian archer unit of 250 men could therefore deliver 2,000 to 2,500 arrows per minute onto a target area. With thousands of archers firing, the Egyptian army was sending between 8,000 and 12,000 arrows per minute into the rebel formation. Even accounting for misses, for arrows that struck shields or armour without penetrating, for shots that fell short or flew over, a substantial percentage found flesh. Within the first 5 minutes of the battle, before the main forces had even engaged, the rebel army had suffered hundreds, perhaps thousands of casualties. The rebel coalition tried to respond with their own archers, but they were neither as numerous nor as well coordinated as the Egyptians. Their volleys were sporadic, uncoordinated, far less effective. Worse, the Egyptian infantry had not yet advanced. The Egyptian archers were the primary targets, and they presented a dispersed, difficult target compared to the massed rebel formations. The psychological impact was as important as the physical casualties. Imagine standing in a shield wall, watching wave after wave of arrows fall from the sky. You cannot see individual arrows in flight, they move too fast. You only see the results. Men around you suddenly crying out, falling, clutching at arrow shafts buried in their bodies. You raise your shield, but arrows can arc over shields, can strike arms, legs, necks, any exposed flesh. The fear is overwhelming. You want to run, to escape this invisible death raining from above. But your commanders are shouting at you to hold the line, to stand firm. After approximately 15 minutes of this systematic destruction, Thutmose gave the order for the general advance. Now came the second phase of the Egyptian attack. The chariots moved forward, Thutmose himself in the lead aboard his golden chariot. Egyptian chariots were technological marvels, lightweight, maneuverable, each carrying a driver and an archer. These chariot archers wielded composite bows and had trained to shoot accurately from a moving platform, a skill that required years of practice. The Egyptian chariot corps charged across the plain at full gallop, horses at full extension, wheels thundering across the ground. And as they charged, the archers in the chariots continued to shoot, releasing arrows at the enemy formation even while bouncing across uneven terrain at high speed. This was mobile firepower on a scale the ancient world had never seen. The rebel forces, already shaken by the arrow storm, now faced a new terror. Fast-moving chariots closing from multiple directions, arrows flying from these mobile platforms, impossible to track, impossible to effectively counter. The rebel chariot units moved to intercept, but they were met by the full weight of the Egyptian chariot corps. Egyptian doctrine called for chariot archers to engage first, shooting at enemy chariots and their crews from relatively long range, attempting to kill horses or disable vehicles before they could close. Only after the initial exchanges would the chariots close for melee. Now the Egyptian infantry advanced, moving forward in good order behind the wall of archery fire. and behind the infantry came more archers, shooting over the heads of their own troops in high arcing volleys designed to fall into the middle and rear ranks of the enemy. This technique, called plunging fire, was one the Egyptians had developed through experience. Arrows shot at flat trajectories were stopped by the front ranks of shields, but arrows shot high could fall onto the middle and rear of enemy formations where soldiers had less protection. The rebel army began to break. First individuals, then small groups, then entire units turned and ran toward the safety of Megiddo's walls. The disciplined Egyptian advance became a pursuit. Egyptian chariots raced after fleeing rebels, archers shooting them in the back as they ran. It was a slaughter. The Canaanite coalition, which had seemed so formidable just an hour before, was dissolving into a panicked mob. If Thutmose's infantry had maintained their advance, if they had pursued the fleeing enemy right to the walls of Megiddo, the city might have fallen that day. But here, military discipline broke down. The Egyptian soldiers, seeing the abandoned rebel camp filled with wealth, weapons, supplies, and treasure, stopped to plunder. Despite the shouted orders of their commanders, despite Thutmose's fury, they could not be restrained. For common soldiers, plunder was the only way to get rich. They were not going to pass up this opportunity. The delay gave the rebels time to reach Megiddo's walls. The citizens inside hauled them up on ropes, since in their panicked flight they had not even taken time to use the gates. By the time the Egyptian army reorganized and approached the city, Megiddo's defenders had recovered enough to man the walls. What could have been a swift victory now became a siege. Thutmose, enraged at the lost opportunity, ordered a complete investment of the city. His engineers constructed a moat around Megiddo's walls and built a wooden palisade around the moat. No one was allowed to leave the city. No supplies could enter. The siege lasted 7 months, possibly 8. Finally, weakened by starvation and with no hope of relief, the city surrendered. Thutmose offered generous terms. None of the rebel leaders were executed. The city itself was not sacked. In return, the coalition leaders swore oaths of loyalty to Egypt and agreed to pay tribute. Thutmose understood that ruling through cooperative vassals was more effective than ruling through terror. But the real significance of Megiddo was not the siege but the battle that preceded it. For the first time in recorded history, massed archery fire had been the decisive factor in a major engagement. The rebel army had not been defeated by superior hand-to-hand fighting. They had been defeated before the main forces ever really engaged. They had been broken by thousands of arrows falling from the sky in disciplined, coordinated volleys. This was a new kind of warfare. Thutmose's campaign journal, later inscribed at Karnak, recorded the battle in detail. It included the first known body count in military history, listing enemy casualties, captured equipment, seized animals, and taken prisoners. The inscription specifically mentioned the role of archers and the use of composite bows, providing what historians believe is the first written reference to composite bows being used in a decisive military role. The implications were enormous. Every major power in the Near East studied what had happened at Megiddo. The message was clear. Armies that could mass archers and coordinate their fire could dominate the battlefield. Infantry was no longer king. The ability to kill at distance, to break enemy formations before they ever closed to hand-to-hand range, was the new paradigm. Over the following centuries, archery would become increasingly central to ancient warfare. The Assyrians, who built an empire in the 9th through 7th centuries BC, made extensive use of archers both on foot and mounted. Persian armies under Cyrus the Great and his successors relied heavily on massed archery. The Parthians, who defeated Roman legions in 53 BC at Carrhae, did so primarily through mounted archery. Even the Chinese on the other side of the world developed similar doctrines, using massed crossbow fire to devastating effect. But Megiddo was the beginning. It was the battle that demonstrated beyond doubt that organised massed archery fire could decide the outcome of warfare. It required technology, the composite bow. It required training, years of practice to create effective archers. It required doctrine, commanders who understood how to position and employ archers to maximum effect. And it required logistics, the ability to supply thousands of arrows to thousands of archers during sustained combat. The Egyptians in 1457 BC had all of these elements. The composite bow they had adopted from the Hyksos had been refined and improved. Egyptian and Nubian archers had trained for years to achieve the skill levels needed. Egyptian commanders had developed tactics for integrating archers into combined arms formations, and Egyptian logistics networks could supply the enormous quantities of arrows required. Let us consider the numbers more carefully. If we assume the Egyptian army at Megiddo included 4,000 dedicated archers, a conservative estimate, and each archer carried 50 arrows, that is 200,000 arrows available for the battle. If the initial bombardment lasted 20 minutes, with archers firing at an average rate of 8 arrows per minute, that is 160 arrows per archer, or 640,000 arrows total. Of course, not all archers would maintain maximum rates of fire throughout. Some would run out of arrows, some would be engaged in other tasks. But even if we assume only half that number, 320,000 arrows, fell on the rebel army during the opening phase of the battle, the effect would have been catastrophic. An infantry formation of 10,000 men, even tightly packed, occupies an area of roughly 200 by 100 yards, or 20,000 square yards. If 320,000 arrows fell on that area, that is 16 arrows per square yard. Even accounting for wide dispersal, for arrows that missed the formation entirely, for shots blocked by shields, the casualty rate would have been enormous. Modern estimates based on experimental archaeology and historical accounts suggest that well-aimed archery fire could achieve casualty rates of 10 to 20% against unprotected infantry in the first few minutes of combat. Against partially protected infantry, with shields and some armour, casualties might be lower, perhaps 5 to 10%. But even at the lower end, that means the rebel army at Megiddo suffered 500 to 1,000 casualties from archery alone before the main forces engaged. These are not kills necessarily. Many would be wounded with varying degrees of severity. But a man with an arrow in his arm or leg is combat ineffective. He cannot fight. He needs medical attention. And his screaming and bleeding affects the morale of those around him. The psychological multiplier of archery casualties is significant. When men see their comrades falling around them from invisible missiles, when they hear the screaming of the wounded, when they smell blood and see men trying to pull arrow shafts from their bodies, the effect on morale is devastating. Units that might stand firm against a visible enemy charging across open ground will break and run when subjected to prolonged arrow fire. This was the lesson of Megiddo. Archery, properly employed, was not just a harassment tactic, it was a war-winning weapon, and the Egyptians had mastered it first. Thutmose III went on to campaign in the Levant for the next 20 years, conducting 17 military campaigns that extended Egyptian control from Nubia in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. He is often called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, and with good reason. His military genius lay not just in personal courage or tactical brilliance, though he had both, but in his understanding of combined arms warfare. He knew how to use archers, infantry, and chariots in coordination, how to maximize the strengths of each while minimizing weaknesses. But it all began at Megiddo, with massed archers deciding a battle for the first time in recorded history. It is worth noting what came after. The next several centuries saw a steady refinement of archery tactics across the ancient Near East. Armies became larger, archer units became more numerous, training became more systematized. But the fundamental principles established at Megiddo remained. Mass fires, multiple archers shooting at the same target simultaneously, coordinated volleys, timed releases to maintain continuous pressure, combined arms integration, using archers to support and be supported by other unit types, and logistics, the unglamorous but essential work of ensuring arrows reached the archers who needed them. By the time of the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC, less than 200 years after Megiddo, both the Egyptians and their Hittite opponents fielded armies with thousands of archers. The battle, which involved perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 chariots, the largest chariot battle in history, saw arrow storms of unprecedented scale. Estimates suggest that in the first hour of combat, over 1 million arrows were fired by both sides combined. The sky, according to later accounts, was darkened by the sheer number of arrows in flight simultaneously. This was the world Megiddo had created, a world where the ability to deliver massed arrow fire was essential to military success, a world where rulers invested enormous resources in training archers, producing bows and arrows, developing tactics and doctrines, a world where battles might be decided at 200 yards range, before the armies ever came to grips in hand-to-hand combat. the dominance of archery would continue for centuries. Greek hoplites, famous for their heavy armour and close order, fighting nevertheless employed auxiliary archers, usually Cretan or Scythian mercenaries, to support their phalanxes. Alexander the Great's army included thousands of archers, both on foot and mounted. The Romans, though they are remembered for their legionary infantry, fielded substantial numbers of auxiliary archers, often recruited from peoples famous for their archery skills: Cretans, Syrians, Numidians. The mounted archers of the Asian steppes, the Scythians, Parthians, and later the Mongols, would demonstrate that the principles established at Megiddo could be applied to mobile warfare. A mounted archer, skilled enough to shoot accurately from horseback while at full gallop, combined the firepower advantage of archery with the mobility advantage of cavalry. The Parthians destroyed Roman legions at Carrhae in 53 BC through the use of mounted archers who simply rode around the Roman formations, shooting arrows until the legionaries were too exhausted and demoralized to resist. The Mongols, over a millennium later, would conquer the largest land empire in history using similar tactics. In Europe, the longbow would reach its apex during the 100 Years' War. At Crécy in 1346, English longbowmen firing massed volleys destroyed French cavalry and infantry, demonstrating that the lessons of Megiddo applied even in medieval Europe. At Agincourt in 1415, a smaller English army again used massed longbow fire to defeat a much larger French force. Only with the development of effective firearms in the 16th century would the dominance of archery finally end. Even then, the transition was not immediate. Armies continued to employ archers alongside musketeers well into the 1600s in some regions, but eventually the gun replaced the bow because it required less training, was more effective against improved armour, and had superior penetrating power. But for over 3,000 years, from 1457 BC to approximately 1500 AD, archery dominated warfare. And it all began at Megiddo, on a spring morning in 1457 BC, when Pharaoh Thutmose III deployed his archers in massed formations and demonstrated that battles could be decided by arrows falling from the sky. The Battle of Megiddo established principles that every subsequent military commander would need to understand. The principle of standoff engagement, killing the enemy at maximum possible range. The principle of concentration of force, massing fires on key enemy positions. The principle of combined arms, using different unit types in mutual support. And the principle of logistics, ensuring that soldiers have the supplies they need to fight effectively. These principles remain relevant even today. Modern military doctrine still emphasizes standoff engagement, though with artillery and missiles rather than arrows. Concentration of fires is still essential. Combined arms warfare, coordinating infantry, armour, artillery and air support, is still the foundation of effective operations, and logistics, often called the defining characteristic of modern warfare, was just as important in 1457 BC as it is now. Thutmose III understood all of this. He understood that the composite bow, in the hands of trained archers, employed in mass, could break enemy formations. He understood that coordinated fire was more effective than individual marksmanship. He understood that archers needed support from infantry and chariots, and that infantry and chariots benefited from archery support. He understood that arrows had to be manufactured, transported, and distributed on the battlefield. And he put all of this understanding into practice at Megiddo. The result was the first historically documented decisive use of massed archery fire in battle. The Canaanite coalition, despite having roughly equal numbers and fighting on defensible ground near their own fortress, was broken primarily by Egyptian arrow fire. The hand-to-hand fighting when it came was almost anticlimactic. The rebels had already been defeated by the thousands of arrows that had fallen on them in the opening phase of the battle. This was revolutionary, and every military power in the ancient world took note. Within a generation, the armies of the Hittites, the Mitanni, the Assyrians, and other powers were reorganizing their forces to emphasize archery. The composite bow spread throughout the Near East and beyond. Training programs for archers became standard. Tactics for employing massed archery fire were developed and refined. In a very real sense, Megiddo marked the beginning of a new era in warfare. Before Megiddo, battles were primarily decided by close combat between infantry formations. After Megiddo, battles were decided by whoever could deliver the most effective fire at range. This remained true even as weapons evolved. crossbows, firearms, artillery, all followed the same principle established by the Egyptian archers at Megiddo. Deliver effective fire at maximum possible range. Concentrate that fire on key enemy positions. Coordinate fires across multiple units. Ensure adequate logistics to sustain fire over time. The archers who stood in the Egyptian formations on May 15, 1457 BC, probably did not know they were making history. They were following orders, doing what they had trained to do, drawing, aiming, and releasing their composite bows in coordination with their comrades. But they were doing something that had never been done before at that scale and level of coordination. They were demonstrating that archery could be a decisive weapon, and they were changing warfare forever. When the sun set on Megiddo that evening, the battlefield was littered with arrows. Thousands upon thousands of bronze-tipped shafts, most broken or bent, many still embedded in shields or the ground or in bodies. In the weeks that followed, locals would collect these arrows, straighten those that could be salvaged, melt down the bronze heads for reuse. But the memory of what those arrows had accomplished would not fade. The Battle of Megiddo, and the decisive use of massed archery fire, would be remembered and studied by military commanders for thousands of years. The inscriptions at Karnak, detailing Thutmose's campaign, would be read by generation after generation of priests and scribes, ensuring that the lessons of Megiddo were not forgotten. And those lessons were simple but profound. Train your archers well. Equip them with the best weapons available. Employ them in mass. Coordinate their fire. Support them with other arms, and ensure they have enough arrows to sustain combat. Do these things, and you can win battles before the enemy ever reaches you. This was the gift of Megiddo to military history. And it all began with composite bows and trained archers, standing in formation on a plain in northern Canaan, sending wave after wave of arrows into the sky, watching them fall on the enemy like deadly rain, and discovering that this, more than courage or skill in hand-to-hand combat, was the key to victory. Massed archery had decided its first battle. It would not be its last. The tactical innovations demonstrated at Megiddo did not emerge in a vacuum, and understanding their full significance requires examining what happened in the decades and centuries that followed. The Egyptian army that marched home from Megiddo in late 1457 BC carried with it not just plunder and prisoners, but knowledge of what massed archery could accomplish, knowledge that would reshape Egyptian military doctrine, and eventually the military doctrines of every power in the ancient Near East. Thutmose III was not content to rest on his laurels. Over the next 2 decades he would conduct 16 more campaigns into the Levant and Syria, each one refining and perfecting the tactics he had pioneered at Megiddo. His scribes kept meticulous records of these campaigns, and while none are as detailed as the account of Megiddo, they provide glimpses of an evolving military system. In his 5th campaign, around 1453 BC, Thutmose encountered a Mitanni army in northern Syria. The Mitanni were themselves skilled in chariot warfare and archery, having developed similar technologies independently. The battle that ensued saw both sides employing massed archery tactics. Egyptian records claim victory, but the casualties were significantly higher than at Megiddo. The Mitanni had learned the lessons of coordinated archery fire, and they were not going to be caught unprepared as the Canaanite coalition had been. This marked an important evolution. When both sides possess the same weapons and tactics, victory goes to whoever can execute better, whoever has superior training, discipline, and coordination. The Egyptians, under Thutmose's leadership, maintained their edge through systematic training and doctrine development. Egyptian archer training became increasingly formalized during this period. Young recruits, often starting as teenagers, would spend years learning their craft. They would begin with light training bows, gradually working up to full-weight combat bows as their strength increased. They practiced at varying distances, learning to judge range instinctively. They practiced shooting at moving targets, at targets partially concealed behind obstacles, at targets representing different enemy types. Crucially, they practiced shooting in formation, learning to coordinate with dozens or hundreds of other archers. This was perhaps the most important skill and the hardest to teach. An individual archer, no matter how skilled, has limited impact on a battlefield. But a formation of archers, all releasing simultaneously on command, creates a concentration of fire that is far more than the sum of its parts. The mathematics of this are worth considering. Suppose you have 100 archers. each with a 10% chance of hitting a specific target at 200 yards. If they all shoot at different targets, you would expect 10 hits total. But if all 100 shoot at the same target simultaneously, the probability of at least one hit approaches certainty. In fact, the probability of no hits is 0.9 to the power of 100, which is essentially zero. The target will almost certainly be hit, probably multiple times. This is the power of concentration, and it extends beyond individual targets to area targets, formations of enemy troops. A dispersed formation of 100 archers, each choosing their own targets, might hit 50 men spread across an entire enemy army. But those same 100 archers, concentrating their fire on a specific section of the enemy line, might hit 50 men all in the same company or battalion. The impact on that specific unit's morale and combat effectiveness is devastating. Egyptian commanders understood this intuitively, even if they could not express it in mathematical terms. They developed hand signals and drum beats to coordinate archery fire. When the commander raised his arm, archers would draw. When he dropped it, they would release. Simple, but effective. With practice, a formation of several hundred archers could achieve remarkable coordination, their arrows arriving at the target within a second or two of each other. The Assyrians, who rose to power several centuries after Megiddo, would take these concepts even further. Assyrian reliefs from the 9th and 8th centuries BC show archers operating in pairs. One archer would hold a large shield, protecting both himself and his partner. The second archer would shoot from behind this protection. This allowed Assyrian archers to maintain fire even while under enemy archery, with the shield bearers absorbing incoming arrows while their partners continued shooting. The Assyrians also developed the first known dedicated archer corps, professional soldiers whose sole function was archery. Earlier armies, including the Egyptians at Megiddo, had included many part-time soldiers, farmers and craftsmen who served when called upon. The Assyrians created standing units of archers who trained year-round, achieving levels of skill and coordination that part-time soldiers could never match. Assyrian kings boasted in their inscriptions of archer units that could darken the sky with their arrows, a phrase that appears repeatedly in Assyrian royal annals. While clearly hyperbolic, it reflects the psychological impact that massed archery had achieved by this period. The very image of arrows filling the sky had become synonymous with military might. The effectiveness of archery created an arms race in defensive technology. Shields became larger and heavier. Armor became more sophisticated. Bronze scales sewn onto leather backing provided reasonable protection against arrows at longer ranges. The development of iron working, beginning around 1200 BC, eventually led to iron scale armor and iron helmets, which offered even better protection. But armor has always been a compromise between protection and mobility. Heavier armor protects better, but exhausts the wearer more quickly and reduces mobility. Lighter armor allows for faster movement, but offers less protection. Ancient commanders had to balance these factors based on their tactical doctrine. Infantry expected to close to hand range might accept heavier armor, sacrificing some mobility for protection. Skirmishers and light troops needed to stay mobile and could not afford heavy armor. The archers themselves faced this dilemma. They needed freedom of movement to draw their bows, which required considerable upper body flexibility. Heavy armor on the chest and shoulders would interfere with this, but they also needed protection, especially from enemy archers. The solution most armies adopted was selective armor. Archers would wear helmets and sometimes scale armor on their torsos, but their arms would be left relatively unprotected to allow for the full range of motion needed to draw a bow. This made archers vulnerable in close combat, which is why they were typically positioned behind infantry formations or on the flanks, where they could be protected by heavier troops if the enemy closed. The composite bow itself continued to evolve after Megiddo. Bowyers, the craftsmen who made bows, experimented with different woods, different types of sinew, different adhesives. They learned that certain woods had better compression resistance, making them ideal for the core. They discovered that sinew from the lower legs of deer and cattle was particularly strong and elastic. They developed adhesives from fish bladders and animal hides that were stronger and more water-resistant than earlier glues. By the time of the Assyrian Empire, composite bows had become truly sophisticated instruments. The recurve design, where the tips of the bow curve away from the archer when unstrung, became standard. This design stores more energy for a given draw weight, allowing for either more powerful shots or the same power with less physical effort. Assyrian bows could penetrate bronze armour at 150 yards and kill unarmoured targets at over 300 yards. The effective range, the distance at which a skilled archer could reliably hit a man-sized target, was around 200 to 250 yards, essentially the same as at Megiddo but achieved with bows that were more reliable, more durable and easier to maintain. Arrow design also advanced. Early bronze arrowheads were simple triangular or leaf-shaped designs. Over time, specialized heads were developed for different purposes. Armor-piercing bodkin points, narrow and reinforced, designed to punch through scale armor and helmets. Broad heads with wide cutting edges, designed to cause maximum bleeding in unarmored targets. Barbed heads that were almost impossible to remove without causing additional trauma. Fire arrows with specially designed heads that could carry burning material, used to set fire to wooden fortifications or supply dumps. Some armies even experimented with poisoned arrows, though this seems to have been relatively rare. The difficulty with poison is that most substances that are deadly enough to be militarily useful also degrade rapidly. An arrow coated with venom or toxic plant extracts might remain lethal for hours or days, but not weeks or months. Given that arrows were manufactured in bulk and stored, poison was not practical for most applications. The logistics of arrow production and supply deserve closer examination, because they were fundamental to the archery revolution that began at Megiddo. A single arrow, properly made, required considerable skilled labour. The shaft had to be straight, uniform in thickness, and properly weighted. The head had to be securely attached with bindings and adhesive. The fletching had to be carefully shaped and positioned to ensure stable flight. A skilled fletcher, an arrow maker, might produce 20 to 30 high-quality arrows in a day's work. This means that supplying 4,000 archers, each needing 50 arrows, required 200,000 arrows. At 30 arrows per fletcher per day, that is over 6,600 days of labour, or the full-time work of 18 fletchers for a year, and this is just for a single battle. Arrows that miss can sometimes be recovered and reused, but many are lost, broken, or too damaged to salvage. Combat consumption of arrows was enormous. Egyptian logistics records, preserved on papyrus fragments and ostraca, provide glimpses of this supply system. Workshops near major military bases employed dozens of craftsmen producing arrows continuously. Raw materials, bronze for heads, reeds or wood for shafts, feathers for fletching had to be procured, sometimes from distant regions. The finished arrows were then transported to forward magazines near the frontier, stored in dry conditions to prevent warping, and issued to units as needed. During active campaigns, supply trains of donkeys and carts accompanied the army, carrying reserve stocks of arrows along with food, water, and other necessities. When possible, arrows were manufactured or repaired in field workshops, with craftsmen accompanying the army. The Assyrians, with their permanent standing army and extensive logistical infrastructure, perfected this system. Assyrian royal inscriptions mention arsenals storing hundreds of thousands of arrows, ready for immediate use. Reliefs show supply wagons stacked with bundled arrows, being brought forward to resupply archer units during sieges. This level of logistical sophistication was necessary because massed archery tactics consumed ammunition at rates that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. At Megiddo, if our earlier estimates are correct, the Egyptians may have fired 300,000 arrows or more. This represented a significant portion of Egypt's total arrow production capacity for an entire year. Only a state with substantial resources and organizational capability could sustain such expenditures. This is one reason why massed archery, despite its proven effectiveness, was not immediately adopted by every army. Smaller states and tribal confederations simply lacked the resources and infrastructure to field and supply thousands of archers. They might have a few hundred archers, enough to provide supporting fire but not enough to use archery as a decisive weapon in the way Thutmose had at Megiddo. This created a strategic divide between wealthy, organized states that could afford massed archery and smaller polities that could not. The development of siege warfare further demonstrated the versatility of massed archery. When the Assyrians besieged cities, a common occurrence during their campaigns of conquest, archers played multiple roles. They would establish positions around the city walls, maintaining suppressive fire against the defenders. This fire did not need to cause heavy casualties to be effective. Its purpose was to keep the defenders' heads down, preventing them from interfering with siege operations. Assyrian siege engineers could work on battering rams, siege towers, and undermining operations, while archers on the ground and in mobile towers kept up continuous fire against the walls. Defenders attempting to drop stones or fire arrows at the siege workers found themselves targeted by multiple archers simultaneously. This application of archery, using it to enable other operations rather than as a standalone weapon, shows the sophistication of Assyrian tactical thinking. The Persians, who conquered the Assyrian, Babylonian, and Egyptian empires in the 6th century BC, fielded perhaps the largest concentrations of archers in ancient history. The Persian Empire stretched from India to Greece, incorporating dozens of different peoples and military traditions. Persian kings drew on this diversity to create armies that included archers from many different cultures. Median archers, famous for their skill, Scythian mounted archers, renowned for their mobility, Egyptian archers, still maintaining the traditions established by Thutmose III over 1,000 years earlier. Persian infantry formations placed archers in the front ranks, protected by infantry carrying large wicker shields called spara-bearer. These shield bearers would form a wall of protection, and archers would shoot from behind or between them. At the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, the final major battle of the Persian invasion of Greece, Persian archers demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of archery-based tactics. The Persians under Mardonius had perhaps 50,000 to 70,000 troops, including tens of thousands of archers. The Greeks, primarily Spartans and Athenians, had roughly 40,000 hoplites, heavy infantry armed with spears and shields and extensive body armour. The initial exchanges favoured the Persians. Their archers maintained steady fire against the Greek formations, and the Greeks, armed primarily for close combat, had difficulty responding. Arrows that struck the bronze armour and shields of the hoplites generally did not penetrate, but the continuous fire was exhausting and demoralising. The Greeks could not charge across open ground against this fire. They would be shot to pieces before closing. But they also could not retreat without being pursued and destroyed. The battle became a test of endurance. Could the Greeks withstand the arrow fire long enough to find an opportunity to close? Or would they break under the continuous pressure? The decisive moment came when the Persian cavalry, which had been harassing Greek supply lines, was defeated in a skirmish. Mardonius, attempting to exploit what he thought was Greek confusion, ordered a general advance. This was a fatal mistake. The Persian infantry moving forward came within charging range of the Greek hoplites. The Spartans and other Greeks charged, covering the final 100 yards at a run, and crashed into the Persian line. In close combat, the heavily armoured Greeks had an overwhelming advantage. Persian archers, unable to use their bows effectively at close range and lightly armoured for mobility, were cut down in large numbers. Mardonius himself was killed. The Persian army broke and fled. Plataea demonstrated the limitations of archery as a sole tactical system. Against heavily armoured infantry willing to accept casualties to close the distance, archers needed support from heavy infantry of their own. The Persians, whose infantry were primarily light troops optimised for mobility and archery, lacked the close combat capability to hold against the Greek charge. This lesson would be learned and relearned throughout military history. Archery was devastating, but it was not omnipotent. It worked best as part of a combined arms system, supported by infantry who could hold ground and protect the archers if the enemy closed. The Mongols, over 1,500 years after Plataea, would perfect this system by making their archers also capable cavalry, able to retreat faster than most enemies could advance, maintaining distance while continuing to shoot. But the innovation was far in the future. In the classical period, the tension between archery and close combat remained unresolved. Different armies found different balances. The Romans, who built an empire that lasted centuries, used archery primarily as a supporting arm. Roman legions were built around heavy infantry, the legionaries with their armour, shields and short swords. But every legion was supported by auxiliary archers, typically recruited from peoples famous for their archery skills. These auxiliaries would soften enemy formations with arrow fire, but the decision would ultimately be made by legionary infantry in close combat. This Roman system worked well against many opponents, but struggled against enemies who could maintain distance and use mobility to avoid close combat. The Parthians, who dominated Persia and Mesopotamia during the Roman imperial period, were masters of mounted archery. At the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, a Parthian army destroyed a Roman force of roughly 40,000 men, killing or capturing most of them. The Parthians achieved this primarily through mounted archery, riding around the Roman formations, shooting arrows, retreating when the Romans tried to charge, then returning to shoot more. The Roman infantry, excellent in close combat, could not bring their strength to bear. They could not catch the Parthian cavalry, and they could not withstand the continuous arrow fire indefinitely. Roman casualties mounted steadily and morale collapsed. The survivors were captured or scattered. Carrhae was Megiddo in reverse. At Megiddo, the Egyptians had used massed archery to break an enemy formation, then pursued with infantry and chariots. At Carrhae, the Parthians used mounted archery without ever committing to close combat, simply shooting until the enemy was too weakened to resist. This demonstrated that the principles established at Megiddo remained valid over 1,000 years later. Concentration of fires, coordinated volleys, combined arms integration, and adequate logistics. The Parthians had all of these, adapted to their military culture of mounted warfare. European armies in the Middle Ages would rediscover these lessons through painful experience. English longbowmen at Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt used massed archery fire in ways that Thutmose III would have recognised. Formations of archers, numbering in the thousands, would establish positions and maintain continuous volleys against charging French cavalry and infantry. The results were remarkably similar to Megiddo. Enemy formations broke under the weight of arrow fire before closing to hand-to-hand range. The English longbow was not a composite bow, it was a self-bow made from a single piece of yew wood. But it was powerful, with a draw weight of 80 to 150 pounds, capable of penetrating armour at close range. And English archers trained from childhood, achieving skill levels comparable to the Nubian archers who had served Thutmose. The key similarity was doctrine. English commanders understood that archery was most effective when concentrated. At Agincourt in 1415, King Henry V had perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 archers and only about 1,000 men at arms, heavily armoured cavalry and infantry. He positioned his archers on the flanks and behind stakes that would protect them from cavalry charges. When the French attacked, advancing across muddy ground, the English archers maintained continuous fire. Each archer could shoot 10 to 12 arrows per minute. With 5,000 archers, that meant 50,000 to 60,000 arrows per minute falling on the French formation. The French, already struggling with the difficult terrain, broke under this fire. Those who reached the English lines were exhausted and easily defeated by the men at arms. English casualties were minimal. French casualties were in the thousands. Once again, massed archery had decided a battle, nearly 3,000 years after Megiddo. The technology was different. Longbows instead of composite bows. The tactical context was different. Medieval armoured cavalry instead of Bronze Age chariot warfare. But the fundamental principles were identical. Train your archers well. Employ them in mass. Coordinate their fire. Protect them from close combat. Ensure adequate ammunition supply. These principles, first demonstrated at Megiddo in 1457 BC, remained valid until the development of effective firearms finally displaced archery in the 16th and 17th centuries. Even then, the transition was not because guns were more accurate or had higher rates of fire. Early muskets were actually inferior to bows in both respects. A skilled archer could shoot farther and more accurately than a musketeer with a matchlock musket. But muskets had two critical advantages. First, they required much less training. You could train a competent musketeer in weeks. Training a competent archer took years. Second, musket balls had superior penetrating power against the increasingly sophisticated armour of the period. A musket ball could penetrate armour that would stop an arrow. These advantages, combined with the shocking psychological impact of gunpowder weapons, eventually tipped the balance. By 1700, archery had essentially disappeared from European warfare, but its legacy remained. Modern military doctrine still emphasises the same principles: concentration of fires, coordinated engagement, combined arms integration, logistical support. The weapons have changed from bows to rifles to artillery to guided missiles, but the underlying concepts remain. When we look back at Megiddo, we are not just seeing one battle in an ancient war. We are seeing the first clear demonstration of principles that would shape warfare for over 3 millennia. Thutmose III and his commanders, whether they fully understood it or not, had discovered something fundamental about how to win battles. deliver effective fires at maximum range, concentrate those fires on key targets, coordinate across multiple units, support missile, troops with close combat troops, ensure adequate supply of ammunition. Do these things better than your enemy, and you will win. This was the gift of Megiddo, and standing behind it all were the archers, Egyptian, and Nubian warriors who had trained for years to master their craft. Men who could draw an 80-pound composite bow repeatedly for minutes at a time without their arms failing. Men who could judge distance and windage instinctively, compensating for their arrow's flight characteristics without conscious thought. Men who could coordinate with hundreds of their fellows, drawing and releasing on command, creating those devastating concentrated volleys. These men were not mindless killers. They were skilled professionals, masters of one of the most demanding martial arts ever developed, drawing a composite bow to its full power, holding it steady while aiming, and releasing smoothly without disturbing the arrow's flight, all while standing in formation under enemy fire requires physical strength, technical skill, mental discipline, and raw courage. The archers at Megiddo had all of these qualities, and because they did, they changed the world.